They gave me the gun because they said I was steady. That was the word Sergeant Holloway used when he pressed it into my hands on that grey morning in the staging depot, the metal already warm from the previous owner's grip. Steady. Like it was a compliment, like it was a gift. I should have known better. I should have noticed how quickly the other soldiers looked away when Holloway walked toward me carrying that sleek blue weapon, how Private Chen suddenly found something fascinating in the stitching of his boot, how Corporal de Silva pretended to adjust her helmet straps with exaggerated concentration. Nobody meets the eyes of a man being handed a death sentence. I understand that now. I understand a great many things now. Sitting here in this rehabilitation ward, with what remains of my hands folded in my lap, waiting for the morning bell that will summon me to another session of what the Medicae officers optimistically call therapy. But understanding came too late. It always does. That is the way of things in the Emperor's service. My name is Marcus Reeves. Private First Class Marcus Reeves of the 447th Antoran Rifles, 3rd Company, 2nd Platoon, or it was. The designation still exists in some cogitator somewhere, I imagine, filed alongside requisition forms and casualty reports and all the other paperwork that gives shape to the Imperium's endless wars. But the man who answered to that name, the steady man who could fire a plasma weapon without flinching, while lesser soldiers trembled at the very thought of wielding such volatile technology, that man burned away on Castellax Prime 17 months ago. What sits here now is something else. Something that wears his scars and speaks with his voice but no longer quite remembers how to be him. The campaign had been grinding on for 3 standard months by the time we made planetfall. Castellax Prime was a forge world, or had been before the enemy came. The manufactorums still stood in most districts, their Gothic spires clawing at a sky perpetually choked with ash and industrial smog, but the forges had gone cold and the production lines lay silent. Something had infected the world from within, a rot that spread through the labor populations and transformed loyal Imperial citizens into howling fanatics who daubed profane symbols on the walls and screamed prayers to things that should not have names. The briefings called them cultists, which was a simple word for a complicated horror. We learned quickly that the simple words were always lies. Holloway found me on the 3rd day after deployment, during one of those rare quiet hours when the enemy had pulled back to regroup and we were allowed to eat our ration bars in something approaching peace. He had the plasma gun cradled in his arms like a newborn, and behind him walked a tech adept whose red robes were stained with oil and what might have been blood. The adept's mechadendrites twitched with what I can only describe as eagerness as he watched Holloway approach my position. The previous owner of the weapon had been a man named Garrett. I knew him slightly, the way you know anyone in a rifle company, which is to say I knew his face and his habits and the particular way he cursed when his boots got wet. He had carried the plasma gun for 8 months without incident, which made him something of a legend among plasma gunners. Most did not last half that long. The weapons were temperamental, everyone knew this. They required constant maintenance, careful monitoring, a gentle touch that seemed at odds with the violence they were designed to inflict, and sometimes, despite every precaution, they simply decided to kill their wielders instead of their targets. Garrett had beaten the odds for 8 months. Then, during a night assault on a manufacturing complex, his luck had run out. They did not tell me the details at first. Later, much later, I heard fragments from soldiers who had been there, how the gun had started venting heat. During a firefight, its cooling systems overwhelmed by sustained fire. How Garrett had kept shooting anyway because the enemy was close and stopping meant dying. How the weapon had made a sound. Witnesses described it differently, but they all agreed it was not like any sound a gun should make. A rising whine that climbed beyond the range of human hearing until their teeth ached and their vision blurred. And then light. Light so bright it left after images burned into their retinas for days. Light that was also heat. Heat that was also death. Heat that found Garrett at its center and embraced him with the intimacy of a lover. They found enough of him to fill a field burial box, just barely. Holloway did not tell me any of this when he handed me the weapon. He simply said I had been selected for reassignment, that command had reviewed the company's performance metrics and determined that my accuracy scores and psychological profile made me an ideal candidate for heavy weapons specialization. He said the word steady like it meant something, like it was not just another way of saying expendable. The tech adept performed the bonding ritual right there in the rubble-strewn street, his mechanical voice droning prayers in a language I did not recognize while his mechadendrites connected cables to ports I did not know the gun possessed. I was required to hold the weapon throughout the ceremony, my bare hands pressed against its casing while sacred oils were applied and litanies of function were recited. The metal grew warm under my palms, not unpleasantly warm, not at first. It felt almost like touching something alive, something that pulsed with its own heartbeat just below the surface. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself a lot of things in those days. The adept finished his ritual and disconnected his cables with a series of wet clicking sounds. His optical lenses, 3 of them arranged in a triangle where a human face would have had eyes, focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He spoke, and his words have stayed with me ever since, echoing in the hollow spaces of my memory when the night grows long and sleep refuses to come. "It knows you now," he said. "It will remember." I did not ask what that meant. I was a soldier. Soldiers do not ask questions. We follow orders, we serve the Emperor, and we die when our time comes. Questions are a luxury reserved for those who expect to see tomorrow. Plasma gunners learned quickly not to expect anything at all. The weeks that followed taught me the truth of the weapon I carried. The plasma gun was not merely a tool, not in the way a lasgun was a tool or a knife was a tool. It was a partnership, a marriage of flesh and technology that demanded constant attention and absolute respect. I learned its moods, if such a word could apply to a machine. I learned that it ran hot in the mornings and needed extra time to stabilize. I learned that it disliked rapid firing, that pushing it too hard made it whine in that particular way that every plasma gunner learns to fear. I learned that the cooling vents on its left side sometimes clogged with battlefield debris and required cleaning after every engagement. I learned these things the way you learn the preferences of a sleeping predator you have been forced to share a cage with, through careful observation and controlled fear and the knowledge that a single mistake could cost you everything. The gun itself was beautiful, in its way. I can admit that now, even knowing what it would eventually do to me. Its casing was a deep cobalt blue, chased with silver filigree that depicted scenes of Imperial triumph. The power coils that ran along its barrel glowed with a soft azure light when charged, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. When I fired it, when I released that contained star and sent it screaming toward the enemies of mankind, there was a moment of pure transcendence. The recoil was nothing like a conventional weapon, no sharp kick or jarring impact. Instead, there was a push, a gentle pressure that traveled up my arms and into my chest, accompanied by a wave of warmth that bordered on pleasant. In those moments, I understood why some plasma gunners spoke of their weapons with something approaching love. The gun made you feel powerful, it made you feel chosen. It made you forget, however briefly, that it was just as likely to kill you as protect you. I should have been more careful. I should have refused that final mission, should have reported the irregularities I had noticed in the gun's behavior over the preceding days. But soldiers do not refuse missions, and the irregularities seemed so minor. A slight hesitation in the firing mechanism, a temperature gauge that read a fraction higher than usual, the cooling vents that required cleaning twice as often as they had when I first received the weapon. I told myself these were normal signs of wear, the inevitable degradation that came from weeks of constant combat. I told myself the tech adepts who serviced our weapons would have noticed if anything was seriously wrong. I told myself lies because the truth was too frightening to contemplate, and I was supposed to be steady. The assault on the Pyrrhus Manufactorum was meant to be a straightforward engagement. Intelligence reported that cultist forces had established a command node in the complex's central forge hall, a sprawling cathedral of industry where giant crucibles once melted metal for the war machines of the Imperium. Our objective was simple: eliminate the command node, disrupt enemy coordination, withdraw before their reinforcements could respond. 3 platoons would make the assault while armored support provided covering fire from the manufacturum's outer perimeter. Command estimated the operation would take 4 hours. They were optimistic, as Command always was. They were also fools. We went in before dawn, moving through the manufacturum's maze of corridors and production floors, with the careful discipline that weeks of urban combat had instilled. The complex was vast, larger than any single structure I had ever entered, its scale designed for machines rather than men. Overhead cranes capable of lifting battle tanks loomed in the darkness like sleeping giants. Conveyor systems wide enough to carry armored vehicles stretched into shadows that our lumen sticks could not penetrate. The air was thick with the smell of old oil and cold metal and something else, something organic and wrong that made my stomach clench with instinctive revulsion. I felt the gun growing warm against my side as we advanced, not alarming warm, not yet, but noticeably warmer than the ambient temperature of the manufacturum's unheated interior. I told myself it was because my body heat was transferring into the weapon. I told myself a lot of things. We made contact with the enemy at the entrance to the central forge hall. They came at us from the shadows, from doorways we had not noticed, from maintenance hatches in the floor that should have been sealed decades ago. They were screaming, always screaming, their voices blending into a single wall of sound that seemed to press against my skull from the inside. Some of them were still recognizably human, former workers and hab-dwellers, twisted by fanaticism but physically unchanged. Others had progressed further down whatever dark path they walked. Their bodies were wrong in ways that my mind refused to fully process. Limbs that bent in too many places, mouths that opened too wide, eyes that glowed with colors that should not exist. I fired. We all fired. The corridor became a hurricane of las bolts and solid slugs and the brilliant blue-white fury of plasma discharge. My weapon sang in my hands, each shot a small sun that I hurled into the enemy ranks, each impact a miniature apocalypse that vaporized flesh and melted bone and turned screaming fanatics into pillars of incandescent gas. I was doing what I had been trained to do. I was being steady. The gun grew warmer. I noticed but did not stop. Stopping meant dying. The cultists kept coming, climbing over the bodies of their fallen comrades with that horrible enthusiasm that marked the truly lost, those souls so far gone that death held no terror for them. For every one I killed, 2 more seemed to take their place. My finger never left the trigger. My eye never left the sights. My weapon never stopped firing. The temperature gauge on the gun's stock crept into the yellow zone. I saw it in my peripheral vision, a small warning that should have meant something, but the battle was too close and too loud and too desperate for caution. Holloway was shouting orders somewhere behind me. Jen was screaming, whether in rage or pain I could not tell. De Silva had gone quiet, which was worse. The gun was getting hot, hot enough now that I could feel it through my gloves, but I kept firing because that was what plasma gunners did. We kept firing until the enemy was dead, or we were. Private First Class Thomas Mercer was standing 3 meters to my left when it happened. I had known him for 6 weeks, which made him practically family by the standards of the campaign. He was young, barely out of the shola, with the kind of earnest dedication to duty that veterans found either endearing or pathetic depending on our moods. He had asked me once, during a quiet moment between engagements, what it was like to fire a plasma gun. I had told him it was like holding a piece of the sun. I had meant it as poetry. I had not meant it as prophecy. The gun made the sound that Garrett's witnesses had described, the rising whine that climbed beyond hearing into something felt rather than heard. I knew immediately what was happening. Some part of me, some instinct honed by months of partnership with the weapon, recognized the end when it came. I had perhaps half a second to react. Less than that. Time enough for a single thought, a single decision, a single choice that would define everything that came after. I could have thrown the gun away from me. That was the training, what little training plasma gunners received. If your weapon begins to overheat beyond recovery, you discard it immediately and take cover. Standard procedure. Sensible procedure. Procedure that would have saved my hands, my arms, the left side of my face. But Mercer was standing 3 meters to my left. Young Mercer with his earnest questions and his fresh from shola idealism. If I threw the gun in any direction except directly ahead, into the mass of charging cultists. The blast radius would catch him, would catch others, would kill my own squad as surely as any enemy weapon. So I held on. The world became light and heat, and a sound like the death of stars. I remember very little of the actual moment of detonation. My mind has mercifully drawn a veil over those seconds, but my body remembers. My body will never forget. I felt the skin of my palms separate from the muscle beneath. I felt my gloves melt and fuse with what remained of my fingers. I felt the heat travel up my arms like liquid fire being injected directly into my veins. I felt the left side of my face tighten and contract and begin to burn. The plasma washed close enough to sear flesh, but not quite close enough to kill instantly, leaving me alive enough to feel everything. I must have screamed. They told me later that I screamed for almost a minute before the shock set in, and my body finally granted me the mercy of unconsciousness. I do not remember screaming. I remember heat. I remember the smell of my own flesh cooking, a smell that still visits me in dreams, a smell that makes me vomit even now when I catch something similar in the Medicaid ward's sterilization chambers. I remember falling, my legs no longer responding to commands, my arms no longer feeling like arms. I remember the blue afterimage of the plasma blast burned into my vision, a ghost that followed me into unconsciousness and lingered for weeks afterward. Mercer lived. That is what they told me when I finally woke, 4 days later, in a field hospital that smelled of counterseptic and despair. Private First Class Thomas Mercer had survived the assault on the Pyrrhus Manufactorum. He had suffered minor burns to his left shoulder and arm, injuries that would heal with minimal scarring. He was expected to return to active duty within 2 weeks. My choice, my decision to hold the weapon instead of throwing it, had saved his life. They seemed to expect me to find comfort in this. The Medicaid officers, the visiting commanders, the chaplain who came to my bedside to speak of sacrifice and duty, and the Emperor's grace, they all spoke of Mercer's survival as though it were a prize I had won, a reward that should make the pain worthwhile. They did not understand. They could not understand. Mercer was alive, yes, and I was glad of it, as glad as I was capable of feeling anything through the fog of pain and medication that wrapped my consciousness like a funeral shroud. But his survival did not change what had happened to me. His life did not restore my hands. The damage was extensive. I learned this in pieces, in fragments of information delivered by Medicaid officers who seemed almost afraid to tell me the full truth all at once. My left hand was gone, burned away to the wrist, the bone charred and the flesh vaporized in the initial explosion. My right hand survived, technically, but the fingers had fused together in the heat, creating a twisted claw that bore no resemblance to anything human. The burns extended up both arms to the elbows, deep burns that destroyed muscle and nerve and would require months of regenerative therapy to address. The left side of my face had suffered second and third degree burns, melting the ear into a shapeless mass of scar tissue and tightening the skin of my cheek and temple until my left eye could no longer close fully. They showed me a mirror. Eventually. I wish they had not. The face that looked back at me was a stranger's face, a monster's face, half human and half horror. I understood then why the other patients in the recovery ward looked away when I walked past. I understood why the orderlies who changed my bandages moved with such careful professionalism, their eyes fixed on their work, never meeting mine. I had become something that people did not want to see. I had become a reminder of what plasma weapons could do, what service to the Imperium could cost, what it truly meant to be steady. The gun had known me, the tech adept had said. It had remembered, and in remembering, it had marked me forever as its own. Recovery was a word the Medicaid officers used frequently, as though saying it enough times would make it true. I was recovering, they told me. My wounds were healing. My body was responding well to therapy. But recovery implies a return to a previous state, a restoration of what was lost, and no amount of therapy would return my hands or my face, or the man I had been before Castellax Prime. What they called recovery was actually replacement, the construction of something new from the ruins of something destroyed. The Marcus Reeves who emerged from that field hospital after 9 months of surgeries and skin grafts and augmetic fitting was not the same Marcus Reeves who had entered. Could not be that man had burned away with his hands, leaving only ash and memory. They gave me augmetics to replace what I had lost. The left arm terminates now in a mechanical hand, 5 articulated fingers of dark metal that can grip and grasp, and even approximate delicate manipulation. Though I will never play cards again, or write a letter by hand, or feel the texture of another person's skin against my palm, the right hand was salvaged through extensive surgery that separated the fused fingers and reconstructed them with mechanical reinforcement, a hybrid of flesh and metal that functions adequately but feels nothing. The nerve damage was too severe for any amount of therapy to repair. I can use my hands, I cannot feel them. There is a difference. The face required different solutions. The surgeons rebuilt what they could, replacing the melted ear with a prosthetic that functions passably but looks obviously artificial, patching the worst of the scarring with synthetic skin that almost matches my original complexion. Almost, but not quite. In certain lights, especially the harsh fluorescence of Imperial facilities, the boundary between real flesh and synthetic covering is clearly visible, a map of my destruction drawn across my face for all to see. I asked once, during one of the endless therapy sessions that filled my months of recovery, why they had saved me at all, why they had expended such resources on a single common soldier when the Imperium's wars consumed lives by the billion, and replacing me with a fresh recruit would have been infinitely simpler. The therapist, a severe woman with augmetic eyes that clicked softly when she blinked, considered my question for a long moment before answering. "You held the weapon," she said. "You made a choice. The commanders want to understand why." I did not know what she meant at the time. I thought perhaps she was speaking philosophically, suggesting that my decision represented some quality the Imperium valued and wished to cultivate. It was only later, much later, that I learned the truth about plasma gunners and the selection process that chose us and the cold calculation that lay behind every assignment. The truth came from an unexpected source. A man named Castellan visited me during my 6th month of recovery, arriving unannounced in my hospital room with the casual confidence of someone who knew doors would open for him regardless of regulations. He was older than me, perhaps 50 standard years, with the weathered features of a career soldier and the insignia of the Departamento Munitorum on his collar. He did not introduce himself immediately. He simply sat in the chair beside my bed and studied me with eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "You held the weapon," he said eventually. "Most do not." I did not respond. Speech was still difficult, the damage to my face affecting my jaw and tongue in ways the surgeons had not fully addressed. But Castellan did not seem to expect a response. He continued speaking as though delivering a report, his voice flat and factual. "Plasma weapons have a 23% catastrophic failure rate over their operational lifetime," he said. "This figure has remained consistent across all patterns and marks for the past 3,000 years. The Mechanicus understands the causes. They know which components will fail and when. They could design weapons with significantly lower failure rates. They choose not to." He paused, letting this information settle. I felt something cold forming in my chest, a suspicion that I did not want to examine too closely. "The failure rate is intentional," Castellan continued. "A plasma weapon that kills its operator occasionally is a plasma weapon that produces soldiers willing to face any danger. The fear of the weapon keeps gunners alert. The deaths serve as examples to others, and the selection process," he leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on mine. "The selection process ensures that those who are chosen to carry plasma weapons are exactly the kind of soldiers most likely to make the choice you made." "Steady," I managed to say. The word came out slurred, distorted by the damage to my face, but Castellan understood. "Yes," he said. "Steady. It means something very specific in the Munitorum's assessment protocols. It means you value others more than yourself. It means you will hold the weapon when it begins to overheat rather than throw it and save yourself. It means you will die for your squad mates without hesitation, and that death will be spectacular enough to inspire those who witness it while also eliminating the weapon before it can fail again. He stood, adjusting his uniform with practiced precision. "You were never meant to survive," he said. "The selection criteria assume death. You are an anomaly. And the Departamento," he smiled without warmth, "we are very interested in anomalies." He left without explaining what that interest would mean for me. But I understood enough. I had been chosen to die, selected by algorithms that measured my psychological profile and determined that I was exactly the type of person who would sacrifice himself for his squad. The plasma gun, that beautiful blue weapon that had felt so alive in my hands, was never meant to serve me. I was meant to serve it, to carry it until the inevitable failure came, and then to die in a way that benefited the Imperium's endless calculations of morale and resource allocation. I had survived when I was supposed to die. In the eyes of the Departamento Munitorum, this made me a problem to be studied. The months that followed brought more visitors, more questions, more tests designed to determine why I had made the choice I made and whether that choice could be replicated in others. They asked about my childhood, my training, my beliefs, my fears. They asked what I had thought in that half-second before the detonation, whether I had consciously decided to hold the weapon or simply acted on instinct. They seemed disappointed when I told them the truth, that there had been no conscious decision, no heroic calculation, only the immediate awareness that throwing the gun would kill Mercer and holding it might not kill me. Might not. That was what it came down to, in the end. Not certainty, not sacrifice, just a desperate gamble based on the slim hope that the weapon's explosion would not be as devastating as training had suggested. I'd been wrong, of course. The explosion had been exactly as devastating as promised. But the angle of the blast, the position of my body, the particular way I had been, gripping the weapon when it failed, all of these factors combined to push the worst of the plasma wash away from my center mass and into my extremities. A few degrees of difference, and I would have been vaporized like Garrett. A few degrees the other way, and I might have emerged with only minor burns. Luck. That was all it was. Luck and desperation and the blind hope that the universe might show mercy just once. The universe, I have learned, does not show mercy. It only varies the forms of its cruelty. They declared me unfit for combat duty after 12 months of recovery. This surprised no one, least of all me. My hands, despite the augmetics, lacked the fine motor control necessary for accurate weapons handling. My face, despite the reconstruction, frightened other soldiers and undermined unit cohesion. My psychological profile, despite the therapy sessions, showed signs of what the assessors called maladaptive response patterns, nightmares and flashbacks, and an inability to hear certain sounds without experiencing what they clinically termed acute stress responses. I was broken in body and mind, and the Imperium had no use for broken soldiers, but the Departamento Munitorum had use for anomalies. I was transferred to a new unit, if unit is even the right word, a collection of 17 individuals, all of us survivors of incidents that should have killed us, all of us bearing the scars of weapons or systems that had turned against us. Plasma gunners like myself, yes, but also melter operators whose weapons had vented containment, missile crews whose launchers had detonated in the tubes, even a single vehicle driver whose Le Mans Russ had suffered a catastrophic engine failure that by all rights should have cooked him alive inside its burning hull. We were the ones who should have died but did not. The statistical outliers whose survival confounded the Departamento's carefully calibrated projections. Our purpose, they told us, was research. We would be studied, analyzed, our experiences documented and dissected in search of insights that could improve soldier survival rates across the Imperial Guard. This sounded almost noble when they explained it. It sounded almost like our suffering might mean something, might contribute to protecting future soldiers from the fates we had endured. The truth, as always, was more complicated. The research facility was located in the depths of a hive city whose name I was never told. We were housed in a sprawling complex of laboratories and dormitories, surrounded by tech adepts and Medicaid officers and specialists whose precise roles were never explained. They ran tests on us constantly, measuring our physiological responses to simulated stress, analyzing our neural patterns during induced flashback episodes, examining our augmetics for evidence of the biological responses that had allowed us to survive when others died. We were specimens, lab animals, objects of study rather than soldiers deserving of respect. But we were also more than that, in ways we only gradually came to understand. The other survivors and I talked, during the quiet hours between tests, sharing our stories and comparing our experiences. We discovered patterns. The plasma gunners among us had all made similar choices, holding our weapons instead of throwing them, accepting injury to prevent harm to others. The melter operators had all thrown themselves toward their malfunctioning weapons rather than away, instinctively trying to shield their squad mates from the worst of the blast. The missile crews had all attempted to manually clear jammed tubes, knowing the risk, hoping to save the mission. The tank driver had stayed at his controls long after the rational choice would have been to bail out, trying to steer his burning vehicle away from friendly infantry. We had all chosen others over ourselves, every single one of us, and we had all survived through combinations of luck and positioning that the departamentos' algorithms had not anticipated. The research was not about improving survival rates. That was the lie they told us to keep us compliant. The truth was that they were studying why we made the choices we made, trying to understand the psychological factors that led certain soldiers to sacrifice themselves for their units. They wanted to identify those factors, to codify them, to build assessment protocols that could predict which recruits would make the same choices we had made. They were not trying to help future soldiers survive. They were trying to ensure that future soldiers would die in exactly the right ways. I learned this from Dr. Catherine Voss, the lead researcher on my particular case. She told me during one of our sessions, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had long ago stopped questioning the ethics of her work. The Imperium needed soldiers who would sacrifice themselves, she explained. Such soldiers were valuable beyond measure, their deaths serving as force multipliers that improved unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. But identifying these soldiers before they revealed their nature through sacrifice was difficult. The assessment protocols were imprecise. Too many potential sacrifice-inclined individuals were wasted in ordinary combat deaths before they could demonstrate their value. Our survival gave them data. Surviving sacrifices were rare enough that each of us represented a unique opportunity to study the psychology of the sacrifice impulse, to map its neural correlates, to understand the precise combination of factors that produced soldiers willing to die for others. With enough data, Dr. Voss believed they could refine the assessment protocols to identify sacrifice-inclined individuals with near-perfect accuracy. These individuals could then be assigned to positions where their deaths would have maximum impact. Plasma gunners, for instance. The 23% failure rate suddenly made terrible sense. I asked Dr. Voss what would happen to us when the research was complete. She hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know. We were anomalies, she reminded me, statistical outliers whose survival complicated the models. Our continued existence represented a variable that the Departamento would prefer to eliminate. But not yet, she added. First, they wanted to understand why we had survived. First, they wanted to extract every useful data point from our minds and bodies. First, they wanted to ensure that our suffering would not be wasted. I am still here, in this facility whose name I do not know, in this city whose location I cannot determine. 17 months since the Pyrrhus Manufactorum. 17 months since my hands burned away and my face melted and my life as a soldier ended. I am still being studied, still being tested, still being asked to relive the moment of detonation while sensors measure my brain activity and researchers take notes on terminals I cannot read. Mercer wrote to me once, about 4 months after my transfer. A simple letter, barely a paragraph, thanking me for what I did and expressing hope for my recovery. He had been promoted to corporal, he said. He was leading his own fire team now. He wanted me to know that he thought of me often, that he was trying to be worthy of the sacrifice I had made for him. I wanted to write back. I wanted to tell him that there had been no sacrifice, not really, just a desperate gamble that happened to pay off for him while bankrupting me. I wanted to tell him that the steady soldier who saved his life was gone, replaced by something scarred and broken that no longer felt like the same person. I wanted to tell him not to feel guilty, not to carry the weight of my survival on his conscience, because the burden was already heavy enough without adding his gratitude to its mass. But my hands, my new metal hands that feel nothing, could not form the letters, and the facility's communications were monitored. And I was tired, so very tired, of trying to explain things to people who would never understand. The plasma gun is still out there somewhere. They recovered it from the manufacturer after the battle was won, and the enemy command node was destroyed, and the campaign objectives were achieved. A tech adept examined it, performed the necessary repairs, reconsecrated it with the proper rituals. It was issued to a new soldier, another steady individual whose psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for heavy weapons specialization. I do not know his name. I do not want to know. But I think about him sometimes, in the long hours between tests, lying in my narrow bed and staring at the ceiling with my one eye that no longer closes properly. I wonder if he has learned the gun's moods yet, its preferences, its particular way of warning you before something goes wrong. I wonder if he has felt it growing warm in his hands, warmer than it should be, warmer than the training manuals say is safe. I wonder if he has noticed the irregularities, the small signs that could mean nothing or could mean everything. I wonder if he will make the choice when the time comes, and I wonder if he will survive it. The weapon knows him now, just as it knew me, just as it knew Garrett. It remembers, and someday, probably sooner than he expects, it will remind him of what it means to be steady. That is what happens when a plasma gun overheats mid-battle. Not just the burning, though the burning is terrible. Not just the scarring, though the scars never truly heal. What happens is that you discover the truth about your service, about your selection, about the cold calculus that determined you were worth more dead than alive. What happens is that you survive when you should not, and that survival becomes its own kind of prison. A cage made of gratitude and guilt and the endless questions of researchers who want to understand why you lived so they can ensure others die. What happens is that you become an anomaly. And the Imperium, vast and indifferent and hungry beyond measure, always finds uses for anomalies. Even if those uses consume whatever remains of who you used to be, even if the person who finally emerges from the research and the tests and the endless analysis is no longer recognizable as the steady soldier who once held a burning weapon rather than let it harm his friends. Even if survival turns out to be its own kind of death, I held the weapon. That is my confession. That is my crime and my achievement and my damnation, all bound together in a single moment of desperate choice. I held the weapon when I should have thrown it, and now I am held in turn, held by the Departamento's curiosity and the Empire's need for data and the simple biological fact that my heart continues to beat even when my soul has long since burned away. The morning bell will ring soon. The orderlies will come to collect me for another day of tests and measurements and induced flashbacks. I will comply as I always do, because compliance is all I have left. The steady soldier, the sacrifice that failed, the anomaly that refuses to die, and somewhere, on some battlefield I will never see, another plasma gun is growing warm in another soldier's hands. Another rising whine is climbing beyond the range of hearing. Another choice is approaching, inexorable as death, demanding an answer that will either kill or transform. I hope he throws it. I hope he saves himself. I hope he learns what I learned too late, that the Imperium's calculations do not have room for heroism, only for sacrifice efficiently distributed. I hope he survives in a way that does not require surviving. But he will not. The assessment protocols have been refined. The selection criteria have been improved. The Departamento has learned from us, from my burned hands and melted face and the 17 months of data I have provided. The next generation of plasma gunners will be even more precisely chosen. even more reliably self-sacrificing, even more certain to make the choice that kills them instead of their squad mates. That is my legacy. That is what my survival has accomplished, not improved safety for future soldiers, but improved prediction of which soldiers will die in exactly the right ways the Emperor protects, they tell us. The Emperor shields the faithful from harm, but the Emperor's protection has never extended to plasma gunners. We are the shield. We are the sacrifice. We are the bright blue light that illuminates the darkness for one brief blazing moment before we burn away. I held the weapon. I am still holding it. I will be holding it